I'm going to read a bit from my essay, Black and Blue and Blond, which was published in 2015, a couple of years after my daughter was born, and it's the seed of the book project that I'm working on now at the American Academy. There's a millennia-old philosophical experiment that has perplexed minds as fine and diverse as those of Socrates, Plutarch, and John Locke. It's called Theseus' Paradox, or the Ship of Theseus. And the premise is this: the mythical founding king of Athens kept a 30-oar ship docked in the Athenian harbor. The vessel was preserved in a seaworthy state through the continual replacement of old timber planks with new ones, piecemeal, until the question inevitably arose: after all of the original planks have been replaced by new and different planks, is it still in fact the same ship? For some time now, a recurring vision has put me in mind of Theseus and those shuffling pieces of wood. Only it's people I see, and not boats. A lineage of people descending over time. At the end of the line, there's a teenage boy with fair skin and blonde hair, and probably light eyes, seated at a cafe table somewhere in Europe. It's 50 or 60 years into the future, and this boy, gathered with his friends, is glibly remarking, in the dispassionate tone of one of my old Catholic school classmates claiming to have Cherokee or Iroquois blood, that as improbable as it would seem to look at him, apparently he had black ancestors once upon a time in America. He says it all so matter-of-factly, with no visceral aspect to the telling. I imagine his friend's vague surprise, perhaps a raised eyebrow or two, perhaps not even that. And if I want to torture myself, I can detect an ironic smirk or giggle. Then, to my horror, I see the conversation grow not ugly or embittered or anything like that, but simply pass on, giving way to other lesser matters, plans for the weekend, or questions about the menu. And then it's over, just like that. In one casual exchange, I see a history, a struggle, a whole vibrant and populated world collapse without a trace. I see an entirely different ship. I met my wife in a bar off the Place Stalingrad in Paris. That was almost 5 years ago. At the time, I was at the end of my 20s and in the middle of one of the only legitimate bachelor phases I've enjoyed as an adult. Otherwise, there had been a series of more or less monogamous relationships of varying lengths. A frivolous year surfing couches with a Gujarati girl from Toronto, a poignant stint in Buenos Aires with an elegant black girl from Virginia, 8 perfect then imperfect and seemingly inexorable years with a Nigerian Italian chef from uptown Manhattan, with an interlude of 6 intensely felt months in college with my French TA, an exchange student from Nancy, and 4 turbulent teenage years with my first love, someone LL Cool J could easily describe as an around-the-way girl from Plainfield, New Jersey. But on that clear January night in a warm bar overlooking the frigid canal, there was no one else, and I was accountable solely to myself. Valentine came with a mutual friend, sat down catty corner, and who knows how these things actually work, something in her bearing triggered a powerful response. I found her insouciant pout and mane of curls flowing over her old fur coat. She was bundled in, exotic. We hardly spoke, but before I left, I gave her my email address on the chance she found herself in New York, where I was living at the time. 2 months later, while there on a reporting assignment, Valentine wrote to me, and we met a few days later for a drink. That was when I discovered that she was funny and not really insouciant at all, just shy about her English. It turned out we had a lot in common. I saw her a second time a month later in New York, and then again on a work trip to Paris 2 months after that. Summer had just begun, and we fell in love extremely fast. When it was time to go home, she asked me to change my itinerary and join her in Corsica for a week. I did, and when it was really time to leave, she promised to visit me that August in New York. A few days after that, after she landed, I proposed on a rooftop in Brooklyn, overlooking the Empire State Building and the orange Manhattan sky. In retrospect, it had been a very long time by then since I'd thought of myself as having any kind of type. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was simply that the more I studied at large universities, the more I'd traveled and lived in big cities, the more women I'd encountered at home and away, which is just to say the more I'd ventured from my own backyard and projected myself into the world, the more I found myself unwilling to preemptively cordon off any of it. And yet, however naive this could seem now, I had somehow always also taken for granted that, when the time came to have them, my children would, like me, be black. A year ago to the day that I write this, it's about 4 years ago now, Valentine's water broke after a late dinner. In a daze of elation, we did what we'd planned for weeks and woke our brother-in-law, who gamely drove us from our apartment in the northern 9th arrondissement to the Maternité, all the way on Paris's southern edge. At 2 in the morning, we had the streets practically to ourselves, and the route he took, down the hill from our apartment, beneath the green copper and gold of the Opera House, and through the splendor of the Louvre's courtyard, with its pyramids of glass and meticulous gardens, over the Seine, with Notre Dame rising in the distance on one side, and the Grand Palais and the Eiffel Tower simmering on the other, and down the wide, leafy boulevard Saint-Germain Raspail into Montparnasse, through that neon intersection of cafes from the pages of A Movable Feast. It was unspeakably gorgeous. I'm not permanently awake to Paris's beauty or even its strangeness, but that night, watching the city flit by my window, it did strike me that such a place, both glorious and fundamentally not mine, would be my daughter's hometown. Another 24 hours elapsed before Marlowe arrived. When Valentine finally went into labor, even I was delirious with fatigue, not so much standing by her side as levitating there, sustained by raw motion alone, and thinking incoherently at best. On the 4th or 5th push, I caught a snippet of the doctor's rapid-fire French. Something, 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 tête d'oreille. It took a moment before my sluggish mind registered and sorted the sounds. And then it hit me she was looking at my daughter's head and reporting back that it was blonde. The rest is the usual blur. I caught sight of a tray of placenta, heard a brand new scream, and nearly fainted. The nurses whisked away my daughter. The doctor saw to my wife, and I was left to wander the empty corridor until I found the men's room, where I shut myself and wept, like all the other newborns on the first floor. A saline cascade of joy and exhaustion, terror and awe mingling together and flooding out of me in unremitting sobs. When finally I'd washed my face and returned to meet my beautiful, healthy child, she squinted open a pair of inky blue irises that I knew, even then, would lighten considerably, but never turn brown. For this precious little being grasping for milk and breath, I felt the first throb of what has been, every minute since then, the sincerest love I know. An hour or so after that, when Valentine and the baby were back in their room for the night, I fell into a taxi, my own eyes absent-mindedly retracing that awfully pretty route. For the first time I can remember, I thought of Theseus's ship. I realize now that this vision of the boy from the future I've had in my head for the past year traces itself much farther back into the past. It must necessarily stretch back at least to 1971 in San Diego, where my father, who was having been born in 1937 in Jim Crow, Texas, the grandson of a woman wed to a man born before the Emancipation Proclamation. He met my mother, the native Californian product of European immigrants from places like Austria-Hungary, Germany, England, and France. This unlikely courtship came all of 4 years after the Loving v. Virginia verdict repealed anti-miscegenation laws throughout the country. In ways that are perhaps still impossible for me to fully appreciate, their romance amounted to a radical political act, though now, some 4 decades on, it seems a lot less like any form of defiance than like what all successful marriages fundamentally must be, the obvious and undeniable joining of two people who love and understand each other enormously. But that's not the beginning either. This trajectory I now find myself on no more starts in San Diego than in Paris. Not since it's extremely safe to assume that my father, with his freckles, with his mother's Irish maiden name, and with his skin a shade of brown between polished teak and red clay, did not arrive from African shores alone. As James Baldwin noted of his travels around precisely the kind of segregated southern towns my father would instantly recognize as home, the line between whites and coloreds in America has always been traversed, logically imprecise. The prohibition of social mingling revealing the extent of the sexual amalgamation. There were and still are girls the color of honey, men nearly the color of chalk, hair like silk, hair like cotton, hair like wire, eyes blue, eyes green, gray, hazel black like the gypsies, brown like the Arabs, nostrils, narrow nostrils, thin, wide lips, thick lips, every conceivable variation struck along incredible gamuts. Indeed, to be black or white for any significant amount of time in America is fundamentally to occupy a position on the mongrel spectrum. Strict binaries have always failed spectacularly to contain this elementary truth. And yet, in spite of that, I've spent the past year trying to think my way through the wholly absurd question of what it means for a person to be or not to be black. It's an existential Rubik's Cube I thought I'd solved and put away in childhood. My parents were never less than adamant on the point that my my older brother and I are black, and the in many ways simpler New Jersey world we grew up in, him in the 70s and 80s, me in the 80s and 90s, tended to receive us that way without significant protest, especially when it came to other blacks. This is probably because, on a certain level, every black American knows what, again, Baldwin knew. Whatever he or anyone else may wish to believe, his ancestors are both white and black. Still, in the realm of lived experience, race is nothing if not an improvisational feat. And it would be in terribly bad faith to pretend there is not some fine, unspoken, and impossible to spell out balance to all of this. And so I can't help but wonder if indeed a threshold, the full consequences of which I may or may not even know in my lifetime, has been crossed. It's not a wholly academic exercise either, since my father was an only child, and in the past year my brother married and had a daughter with a woman from West Siberia. "Aw, son," my father chuckled warmly when he cradled Marlo in his arms for the first time, "she's just a palomino." There was, and there still is, something so comforting to me in his brand of assurance. It's certainly true that in his day and in his fading Texas lexicon, black people could be utterly unflappable when presented with all kinds of improbable mélanges, employing a near infinitude of esoteric terms, not infrequently drawn from the world of horse breeding, which can sound jarring to the contemporary ear, to describe them. I myself had to whip out my iPhone and Google Palomino. It's a pale golden or tan-colored horse with a white mane and tail, originally bred in the southwestern US. But I'd also grown up with other vocabulary, like high yellow and mulatto, in my father's house, if nowhere else, those now anachronistic terms, quadroon and octoroon. What bizarre words these are, but what a perfectly simple reality they labor to conceal and contain. When you get all the way down to it, what all these elaborate, nebulous descriptors really signify is nothing more complicated than that, in the not-so-distant past, if she did not willfully break from her family and try her luck at passing for white, Marlo, blue eyes and all, would have been disenfranchised and subjugated like all of the rest of us. The wisdom, discipline, and brilliant style of American blackness would have been her birthright too. And so there was for a long time something that could be understood as a more or less genuinely unified experience, not without its terrible hardships, but conversely rife with profound satisfactions, which had nothing or very close to nothing to do with genetics. Indeed, even though the absurdity of race is always clearest at the margins, my daughter's case wouldn't even have been considered marginal in the former slave states where theories about hypodescent were most strictly observed, and a person with as undetectable an amount as 1/32 black blood could be legally designated colored. Which is only to say, despite all of the horrifically cruel implications of so-called one-drop laws, until relatively quite recently there was a space reserved for someone like Marlo, fully within the idea of what used to be called the American Negro. But it's not hard to notice that impulse toward unquestioning inclusiveness as a fully justifiable reaction to exclusiveness is going in an increasing number of precincts wherever it is terms like Negro go to retire. The reason has less to do with black people suddenly forgetting their paradoxical origins than with the idea of whiteness continually growing, however reluctantly, less exclusive, with greater than a third of the American population now reporting at least one family member of a different race, and with, since the year 2000, the option to select any combination of races on the census form. The very idea of black Americans as a fundamentally mulatto population is fraying at the seams. Perhaps then mine is the last American generation for which the logic and the illogic of racial classifications could so easily contradict or just gloss over the physical protestations and nuances of the body and face, which is one of the reasons it did initially take me by such surprise to find so many recessive traits flourishing in my daughter. I was being forced to confront a truth I had, if not forgotten, certainly lost sight of for some time. My daughter does not, as so many well-meaning strangers and friends tend to put it, just get those big blue eyes from her mother. But despite the length and narrowness of my own nose and the beige of my skin, I've always only been able to see in the mirror a black man staring back. Nonetheless, it's difficult to shake the sense that I have arrived at a certain bind, in many ways a similar one to that which faces secular Jews. The purpose of all these generations of struggle, I know, has always been the freedom to choose. And yet it's precisely this coveted autonomy that threatens now to annihilate the very identity that won it in the first place. from time to time, feelings, something like panic, creep in. On the one hand, there is the acute and very specific panic of wondering if indeed I have permanently altered the culture or race or ethnicity or the very physiognomy of an entire line of people, like a freight train slowly but irrevocably switching tracks. On the other, there is the subtler, lower decibel gnawing panic, which manifests as a plain awareness of the unearned advantage. It's impossible not to feel that. At a time when, despite all of the tremendous societal progress, blackness, certainly not always, but especially at that vexed intersection with poverty or the cultural signifiers of such, is still subject to all manner of violation and disrespect. At a time when blacks continue to be stopped, frisked, stalked, harassed, choked out, and drilled with bullets in broad daylight and left in the street, what does it mean to have escaped a fate? Put baldly, what is proximity to whiteness worth? And what does color cost? And the reverse. These are questions I don't yet know how to answer. What I do know is that I used to not just tolerate, but submit to, and even on some deep level, need our society's dangerous assumptions about race, even as I suspected them to be irredeemably flawed. It is so much easier to sink deeper into a lukewarm bath than to stand up and walk away. But for my daughter's sake, if not my own, I can't afford to linger any longer. Now, if I find liberation in moments of doubt, it comes with the one movement I always end up having to make. Indeed, the only movement I can make. Away from the abstract, general, and hypothetical, and back into the jagged grain of the here and now, into the specificity of my love for my father, mother, brother, wife, and daughter, and into my sheer delight in their existence as distinct and irreplaceable people, not bodies or avatars or sites of racial characteristics and traits. With them, I'm left with myself as the same, as a man and a human being who is free to choose and who has made choices and is ultimately fulfilled. Yet I know that is also not enough. If the point is for everyone to build ships, set sail, and be free, if we are collectively ever going to solve this infinitely trickier paradox of racism in the absence of races, we are all of us, black, white, and everything in between, going to have to do considerably more than contemplate facades. An entirely new framework must be built because this one's rotten to the core. Thank you.